Okay, good morning. My name is Hayyim. I'm the National Scholar of the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals. Welcome to part 2 of our series on Kohelet. Today we're going to talk about, as the title says, the value of wealth and wisdom. So last time we dealt with the broader framework of Kohelet, and now we're interested in using the methodology from last week to apply to the two most important themes. We're going to review 3 sources that we saw last time in order to plug us into this discussion, which is much more, on the ground of what Kohelet is talking about. Source number 1, we talked about how there are many contradictions in Kohelet, so much so that in source 1, I'll read the English, the sages wanted to hide the book of Kohelet because its words are self-contradictory. So there's a passage in the Talmud that expresses alarm over the existence of contradictions in Kohelet, feeling that, hey, this is a divinely inspired book. And so as a result of that, God should be able to make up his mind even through the inspiration and wisdom of Kohelet. And the fact that there are so many contradictions presents a problem. The Talmud does not deal with the problem systematically, but it does raise the issue. Ibn Ezra, in source number 2, we mentioned him last week, so Irene, sorry in advance. We have to rehash this discussion just to make sure that everybody's on the right page. But thank you for all of your feedback last time. In source number 2, Ibn Ezra represents the dominant view of classical interpretation from time immemorial on Kohelet, which is there is a requirement of the interpreter to resolve the contradictions. And the way he frames it in his commentary is, one sees in Solomon's words in this book difficult matters. In many places, he says one thing and then it's opposite. For this reason, our sages said that the sages wanted to hide Kohelet because its words contradict themselves. It is known that the greatest lightweight among the wise would not compose a book and contradict himself in that book. And so the standard way of thinking about Kohelet, not just Ibn Ezra, this is the dominant view down to into the 20th century, is there are many, many contradictions and we need to fix them. This is not just with regard to Kohelet, mind you. This is a normal thing that you find in traditional interpretation in every biblical book. It's just that Kohelet happens to have a very high density of contradictions. So far, so good. In the 20th century, several scholars started asking a question that doesn't undermine this assumption, but it frames the whole book, and for that matter, Tanakh learning differently. And that question is, why are there so many contradictions? That's a question that the earlier interpreters did not directly address. They were focused much more on, granted, there are many things that seem to contradict, but they're not addressing on a global level, but why are there so many contradictions? That question was a game changer. And all of a sudden in the 20th century, you start hearing different voices coming to the table saying, instead of seeing contradictions in Kohelet or any other biblical book as something that is inconvenient, that needs to be fixed, let's look at them as an opportunity to understand what is the author trying to do. Because after all, if the author put all of these contradictions in the book, perhaps there is a reason for that. So Rabbi Soloveitchik in the 20th century already represents one of the great Jewish minds of all time, but specifically on this issue, he addresses this globally, not specific to Kohelet, but how Judaism simply doesn't work with Aristotelian logic. So he says, these first 3 sources we did last week, this is review, and then we're going to plug into this week, which is on the ground, how does Kohelet operate? Judaism has never accepted the two-value Aristotelian logic, which, in its principle of contradiction and the excluded middle, states that if A contradicts B, then only one of them is right and the other is wrong. The thing is either B or A, to the exclusion of either being both together or being neither A nor B. Judaism has ignored this principle and has quite often acted as if both A and B are right, in spite of their mutual exclusiveness. Even in the halachic realm, Judaism believes that there is a possibility for a contradiction in the objects without negating either of them. Jewish philosophy and the metaphysic of man can only be understood if the dialectical principle is adopted as the point of departure. In plain English, what it means is that contradictions are built into the world and certainly built into human existence. We should expect to find them in the Bible, in halakha, in philosophy, not because, well, we are very small-minded, but not because we are very small-minded, but because that is the nature of what humanity is. And as a result of that, we have to uphold the contradictions as simply part of a complex reality, rather than simply trying to shrug off this or that contradiction. This third approach, that of Rabbi Soloveitchik, it's not just his. This becomes a very predominant view that you'll find in modern Kohelet scholarship. One of my favorite academic scholars, his name is Michael V. Fox. I mentioned him last week, not to be confused with fabulous actor Michael J. Fox. I'm glad they each have a middle initial, or this would get terribly confusing. Michael V. Fox is already of the new school. He wrote a book, it came out in 1999, so we could still call that 20th century. Where he just points out that the reason why Kohelet has so many contradictions is because human life is complex. Rather than trying to fix any of these contradictions, we have to assume that we have to take in all of Kohelet collectively and simply hear what are the different facets of human reality. This is a view, we'll talk about these views more next time because I think I mentioned this last week. 4 new books have either come out or are about to come out within just a few months on Kohelet, for full-length books on Kohelet. So obviously everybody's looking for life's meaning these days because that's a lot. So nobody even sent me the book. I only got 1 out of the 4 books as a book. The other ones I had to print up PDFs. I had over 1,000 loose pages on my desk going through them. It was a lot of stuff, all dealing with this issue. So 2 of the 4 books that we'll talk about next time, Rabbi Yonatan Grossman and Dr. Erica Brown, together that adds up to very close to 1,000 pages right there. Both of them also espouse this view that Kohelet is contradictory because life has many contradictions. They simply reflect this new reality that we see in the 20th and going into the 21st century. So Michael V. Fox, getting back to him, just because I'm a huge fan of his work, he discusses how there's a difference between the biblical book of Proverbs and the biblical book of Kohelet, both traditionally ascribed, by the way, to King Solomon. The book of Proverbs represents pristine wisdom. Meaning, if you would ask the author of Proverbs, how do you know what you know? He would tell you, this is how my teachers taught it to me. This is my wisdom tradition that goes back millennia. And you would say, okay, there's the weight of tradition on your side. If you ask Kohelet, how do you know what you know? Kohelet would say, well, I've received wisdom from my teachers, same as Mishlei, same as Proverbs, but my eyes are open and I look at human experience and I can't help but notice that human experience does not always match what I was taught. So Kohelet never rejects his wisdom teachings. He simply leaves all of these issues as frustrating quandaries that are part of the nature of life. And he tries to navigate, given that there are these quandaries, never give up wisdom, but how can you live life productively and meaningfully when you know that life is not always what they taught you when you were little? So that's what this shiur is about. This shiur is about the clash between the wisdom that Kohelet received and the wisdom that he sees with his own eyes. Here's what wisdom that he received taught him. Here are just a few basic assumptions. And if you find gaps between your experience and these teachings, join the club. Kohelet's whole point is, yes, every thoughtful human being, at least as an adult, will always have some contradictions, either in your own personal life or at least what you see with your own eyes with others. Okay, here's assumption number 1. If you ask the wise sage of Proverbs, what do you think of a wise person? The answer is a wise person understands the world just right. A fool doesn't, but a wise person most certainly does. Here's another thing. Wise people always make the right decision. But in the meantime, Proverbs teaches that. Wise people always make the right decision because it's typology. Therefore, a wise person always acts righteously because from a religious point of view, that's always the right decision. And a wise person always makes great life decisions. Okay? Another assumption of Proverbs is that wise people are always diligent workers. You have to work hard. That's a very basic axiom of Tanakh, which much of Western society tries to undermine these days, but they're wrong. The right assumption is what Tanakh teaches time and again, which is you work hard. Okay, but Proverbs assumes that wise people always work hard and therefore they are always successful. If you are righteous, you are always rewarded by God. And if you work hard, you will be rewarded with the fruits of your labor. That's the way it should be 100% of the time. Okay, so Proverbs takes that as the typology of wisdom. And then Proverbs also assumes, as any biblical wisdom would assume, that righteous people always have better quality of life than foolish people. Foolish people make bad decisions. They are lazy. They are wicked. Okay, so obviously they will pay the price for all of those things, whereas wise people always make righteous and diligent, good working decisions. Okay, so much for Proverbs. Now, Kohelet accepts all of those teachings and accepts them as true. It's just that he can't help but notice it doesn't always work like that in the real world. And that's what Kohelet is really revolves around. So what he does is he breaks up his discussions into two major buckets. There are other buckets too, but there are really two ultimate buckets that keep coming back. One has to do with our relationship to the physical world, and the other one is our relationship with wisdom. Those are two very basic things that Kohelet takes for granted. If you have these things, you are deemed to be successful in any society. Kohelet starts off with the persona of King Solomon saying, I was the wisest of all time and I was the wealthiest of all time. So I can talk. I'm not somebody who is a failure in life, who's broke, who has made terrible decisions. No. I was at the top of the world. So I can evaluate wisdom and wealth from the perspective of, I know what I'm talking about. I've experienced both to the nth degree, more than any of my readers. That's the premise of Kohelet. So Kohelet then has to deal with, okay, but what's it like for real people, including himself? So he starts with various facets of what it means to pursue physical wealth. One is in source number 4. A lover of money never has his fill of money, nor a lover of wealth has his fill of income. That too is futile. It's very frustrating to him that no matter how much money you have, you're never satisfied. That's just a basic human condition. Erica Brown, in the book I'm going to mention next week, her recent commentary on Kohelet, she quotes some study from a journal called The Atlantic from 2011. They interviewed a couple hundred people that are called the super rich. The super rich are defined in this article of you have at least $25 million in wealth. Okay, that's considered the super rich for this study. So they interviewed these people. For the most part, on average, most of them said they would not be satisfied unless they had, on average, 25% more wealth than they currently have, including one who said, unless I reach a cool billion, I'll never be satisfied. So what was fascinating to me about this study is not just what anybody might intuitively know. People who are very wealthy might not necessarily have happier personal lives. That's not surprising, or at least didn't surprise me. What was surprising is how many of these people are not even comfortable with their level of wealth. They don't consider themselves satisfied even on that area where how much more do you need? I mean, $25 million to those of us who don't have it sounds like an awful lot of money. And it seems like it should be adequate to live comfortably for the rest of your life without any further worries. You might have other problems, but not that one. So the fact is, Erica Brown simply quotes that in the context of this verse, and Kohelet knows what he's talking about, that even people who are wildly wealthy are still looking for more on average. Okay, so that is that. So one thing that he quickly points out is that no matter how much you have, human beings as a species are insatiable. Another thing he points out, similarly in source 5, all of a man's earning is for the sake of his mouth, yet his gullet is not sated. Same point. Never satisfied. It doesn't matter how much we have, how comfortable we seem to be. The human condition is like that. And Kohelet is describing this thousands of years ago. Not a whole lot has changed because it remains true. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, Kohelet points, going back to source 4 over here in verse 10. As his substance increases, so do those who consume it. What then does the success of its owner amount to but feasting his eyes? A worker's sleep is sweet, whether he has much or little to eat, but the rich man's abundance doesn't let him sleep. He says that on average, again, obviously this is not 100% true 100% of the time, but it certainly is true often, that people who have many, many assets also have to worry about these assets a lot more, whereas a hard laborer who has enough to eat can be fine and can sleep better at night without having to have all of those aggravations. And so Kohelet keeps on coming back to that point, that having a lot of wealth hardly guarantees anything other than more worries and more people who want that money of you. Whereas a good laborer at least can be more satisfied with life. Okay. Moving on to a different thing, if you go to source number 6, and I have noted this further futility under the sun. The case of the man who is alone with no companion, who has neither son nor brother, yet he amasses wealth without limit. His eye is never sated with riches. For whom now is he amassing it while denying himself enjoyment? That too is a futility and an unhappy business. They point out the rather obvious point, which is some people amass an awful lot of wealth, but they have nobody to share it with. They have nobody to enjoy life with. So that's sad also. Even if they're perfectly fine, it's sad to not be able to enjoy this wealth with a family, with other people who you can enjoy it with. That's another dimension of wealth. It's possible, in source number 7, to have a lot of wealth, but not to be able to enjoy it. And there is an evil I have observed under the sun. A grave one is it for man. That God sometimes grants a man riches, property, and wealth, so that he does not want for anything his appetite may crave. But God does not permit him to enjoy it. Instead, a stranger will enjoy it. For whatever reason, life conditions now don't enable him to enjoy it, and as a result, somebody else will get it. That is futility and a grievous ill. Even if a man should beget 100 children and live many years, no matter how many the days of his years may come to, if his gullet is not sated through his wealth, I say, the stillbirth, though it is not even accorded a burial, is more fortunate than he. Though it comes into futility and departs into darkness, and its very name is covered with darkness. Though it has never seen or experienced the sun, it is better off than he. Yes, even if the other lived 1,000 years twice over, but never had his fill of enjoyment. For are not both of them bound for the same place? Kohelet's point is that many people may have wealth and not be able to actually enjoy it themselves, and at latest, we all die anyhow. So how much lasting benefit is there with any wealth? Kohelet, throughout his book, talks about how it's possible to lose your wealth prematurely, to leave it to unworthy people. So in source number 8, in that those riches are lost in some unlucky venture, and if he begets a son, he has nothing in hand. Another grave evil is this: he must depart just as he came. As he came out of his mother's womb, so must he depart at last, naked as he came. He can take nothing of his wealth to carry with him. So what is the good of his toiling for the wind? So that is that. So Kohelet is very frustrated by all of these things, but let's face the facts. He's not describing anything that we don't already know. Every single thing that Kohelet describes, that's what's great about this book, is that he's speaking, again, thousands of years ago, but he's speaking to the human condition. None of this has changed in the least. These are simply part of the human reality. And so Kohelet, like I said last time, you and I, we wouldn't have written it as well, but you and I could have written Kohelet because there is nothing in his experience that's outside of our experience. It's simply what people go through. Obviously, different people do different things at different times. Some people live more happy, productive lives, some people less, but we all see these realities with our own lives. One thing that drives Kohelet crazy also is that there is no necessary correlation between working hard and winning. And it bothers him. It should be that if you work hard, you should always succeed. And if you don't work hard, if you're lazy, then you should always fail. The reality is sometimes people are very lazy and still are very successful. And sometimes people are truly diligent and do everything they are supposed to do, and they fail. That bothers Kohelet. But Kohelet never gives up on hard work. He says in source number 9, the fool folds his hands together and has to eat his own flesh. Still, don't be lazy. Yes, it is possible that you'll be lazy and win that big Powerball or Mega Millions or whatever, but most people don't. This is not a good way to go through life, right? The way to go through life is to work diligently, and that is that. If you are lazy, you almost inevitably will fail. If you work diligently, you usually will succeed. There are verses later on in Kohelet, in chapter 9, that he is frustrated that the fast doesn't win the race. But it can be pointed out, one of the worst stories, there are so many stories that are great when you're a kid, and then you realize that they're a disaster. They teach the wrong lesson. One such story is the tortoise and the hare. So I was taught this story. I read it in a book when I was a kid, and it made perfect sense at the time. Slow and steady wins the race, right? The hare was lazy and goofed off and messed around. And then the tortoise just kept on plugging along and finished first. Hooray. But it's the wrong message. The message of Kohelet is the hare should just be more diligent, because then, of course, the hare will always win. The hare is faster, right? The message of the story is incorrect. Yes, a slow tortoise can still beat a lazy hare, but the fastest would be the hare who's diligent. That's the point of Kohelet too. Kohelet never says slow and steady wins the race. He says be steady and you usually will win the race, but there are no guarantees. But if you're lazy, then forget it. Then you almost inevitably will fail. That's Kohelet's ongoing message. Okay. He also points out that it's good to have wealth. No, he never denigrates wealth. Wealth is a blessing from God, and it often can help uh, give influence. It bothers me on so many levels that the most influential moral people in the world, when I say moral, I mean people who are able to preach morality, whether or not they're saying anything moral, are the billionaires. Right? We hear their moral view on everything all the time. And sometimes they really are exemplary people. I don't think they're all bad. Some of them are really excellent people. But in principle, it shouldn't be that way. But in reality, it is. So Kohelet, it was like that in Kohelet's time too. And he says in source number 10, wisdom is as good as patrimony, and even better for those who behold the sun. For to be in the shelter of wisdom is also to be in the shelter of money. And the advantage of intelligence is that wisdom preserves the life of him who possesses it. Meaning, wisdom is good for everybody, but the reality is it's good to be wealthy too, because then people might listen to you. It should be that we lived in a wiser world and people should listen to the wisest people. That's the way it should be. Kohelet knows that. In Proverbs, that's actually the way that it is. Kohelet says, yeah, right. In the real world, it should work like that, but it doesn't always. It helps to have money too. And so Kohelet never backs away from that. But he also focuses on don't be obsessive about the attainment of wealth. He says in source 11, better is a handful of gratification than two fistfuls of labor, which is pursuit of win. It's better to earn enough, work diligently, and be satisfied with your lot. And then you can focus on more worthy pursuits. Don't be lazy, but don't be obsessive with wealth attainment. Or in source 12, a worker's sleep is sweet, whether he has much or little to eat, but the rich man's abundance doesn't let him sleep. It's much better to live a satisfied life and to work diligently than to overdo it and to simply be caught up in life's pursuits. My father wrote a great book. What is it? Uh, Losing the Rat Race, Winning at Life. Great title, great book too. Wrote that many years ago. It was a classic title, and it really says what Kohelet would be a great title for this whole discussion of Kohelet. That one who gets caught up in the rat race will always get caught up and will not win. Kohelet says you have to work to succeed, but there's a way of cutting bait and being able to enjoy life and focus on what's truly meaningful rather than not. Okay, so that's what Kohelet constantly stresses. Hold on. We can now scroll down a little bit over here. Now, one of the most important messages, again, Kohelet talks about it time and again in his book. I think it's actually one of the recurring themes. It could have been written in the 21st century. One of the worst problems of our society, or at least one of the top 50, is the problem of entitlement, where people think that they deserve this or that. So it happens to be an unusually big problem in our day, but it happens to also have been an unusually big problem in Kohelet's day too. Kohelet tries really very hard to disabuse people of two types of entitlement. One is, if you work hard, you deserve to be successful, even though wisdom teaches that that's the way it should be. And the other one is, if you act righteously, then God owes you and you should be successful that way. There are two types of entitlement that the wisdom literature deals with, and Kohelet tries really very hard to disabuse us of both of those forms of entitlement, right? He says that whenever we have anything, we should treat it as a blessing from God rather than pat yourself on the back, well, I deserve that. And so one particularly good expression of this theme is in source number 14. Go, eat your bread in gladness, drink your wine in joy, for your action was long ago approved by God. Let your clothes always be freshly washed, and your head never lack ointment. Enjoy happiness with the woman you love all the fleeting days of life you have been granted to you under the sun, all your fleeting days. For that alone is what you can get out of life and out of the means you acquire under the sun. Whatever it is in your power to do, do with all your might. Where there is no action, no reasoning, no learning, no wisdom in Sheol, which is the grave where you are going. Must enjoy yourself while you can, follow God's words, and everything is a blessing from God. And that's how we should always treat it. We should be grateful rather than entitled. Toward the very end of his book, Kohelet says, youth, enjoy yourself while you are young. Let your heart lead you to enjoyment in the days of your youth. Follow the desires of your heart and the glances of your eyes, but know well that God will call you to account for all such things, meaning live responsibly, follow God's words, and benefit from life while you can. It's all a blessing from God. This is a running theme throughout all of Kohelet, and it's simply one of the best things. So on the one hand, Kohelet is constantly frustrated by the limitations of wealth, by the ephemerality of wealth, by all the different limitations that we've seen, but those are simply all true. What we can do is work hard, do our best to succeed, not be obsessive about that, focus on what's meaningful, and understand that every single thing that we get is a blessing from God. If we do those things, that's the best hope in succeeding for life. It doesn't mean we are guaranteed success, but that's the way that it should be. Before we move on to the discussion of wisdom, let's just go back to sources 14 and 15 because they were both in our source sheets last week too. Ibn Ezra was very terribly uncomfortable with source number 14, you may recall. And he said that here Kohelet is simply quoting fools. And that's Ibn Ezra's trick. Whenever he finds verses in Kohelet troubling to him, he tries to deflect these verses by putting them in the mouth of others, because one thing that Ibn Ezra hates to do is reinterpret Hebrew to mean something that it doesn't mean. He would much prefer to imagine a speaker than to distort the meaning of the words. That's his strategy. He uses this a lot. Most commentaries reject his approach altogether for the simple reason that there is nowhere here, nor in the surrounding verses. I'm not giving you a cherry-picked quotation where if you just look 2 verses prior, you would see Ibn Ezra is right. No, Kohelet never expresses that he's quoting somebody else here. He's simply saying what he says throughout his book, and that's because this is what he says throughout his book. His message is that these are divinely given gifts. We saw in source number 15 that the sages of the Talmud and Midrash were particularly uncomfortable with source 15, where he says, oh, go do whatever you want to do. So like, oh no, this is terrible. Is there no judge? This is going to undermine religion. And then they were pleased once Kohelet concluded his verse, but know well that God will call you to account for all such things. The reality is what Kohelet says here is consistent with what he says throughout the entire book, which is, okay, enjoy every moment of life while you can. Accept it as a blessing from God. Obviously, follow God's rules. These are running themes, not just in this verse. And then that's the best that you can hope to do. Okay, so neither set of verses are troubling at all. They're simply consistent with the rest of the book. But you have to understand them in the context of the whole book, which is what this shiur is trying to do. If you simply look at a lot of excerpts all at once, you realize, okay, the whole book does this. Okay, so much for wealth. Now let's move on to more exciting things like wisdom. So it's not surprising that wisdom should poke holes at wealth, because any wisdom literature will teach you wealth isn't everything. It's important. We all need our food. We all need sustenance. Nobody would denigrate the value of having some wealth. But we understand that all corners of wisdom literature, both Israelite wisdom literature in the Bible and beyond, and non-Israelite, will still place some limitations on it, and they might discuss parameters, what's good and what's not good. With wisdom is an absolute value in wisdom literature. Surprise, well, should be, and it's not surprising that wisdom should be deemed an absolute value, meaning all of us should pursue it all of the time. So that's what the book of Proverbs takes for granted. The book of Proverbs says, okay, all of us should pursue it all the time. And if we did, we would all live a great life all of the time, and our society would be great all of the time. And wouldn't this be a nice world to live in? And the problem is fools. That's the way wisdom literature usually sets it out. Kohelet comes along and says, well, that's true, but, and that's really what the second half of the shiur is about. The second half of the shiur is about, let's bring this into reality. One of the biggest problems is what Kohelet says time and again. Hold on. Okay. That there's, source 16 is perfectly good for this. All these things I observed. I noted that all went on under the sun, while men still had authority over men to treat them unjustly. First of all, there's oppression and unfairness in the world. Then I saw scoundrels coming from the holy site being brought to burial, while such had acted righteously were forgotten in the city. Here is another frustration. The fact that the sentence imposed for evil deeds is not executed swiftly, which is why men are emboldened to do evil. The problem of unfairness in the world is the problem that the Bible created, by the way, if I may say so. The Bible solved, or at least addresses, every other great issue in thought that humans have ever had to deal with. It's fantastic. But it created this one glaring hole. Because after all, with a belief in one God instead of many, and a belief in a providential God, one who is involved in our lives and is omnipotent and omniscient, and who is good, and who promises good things for good people and who promises bad things for bad people, suddenly Tanakh created this one problem, which is if there is simply one exception, God always needs to bat 1,000. To use a baseball terminology, if you don't know what that means, don't worry. It just means God has to always get it right. Okay? The idea that God gets it right most or much of the time is impossible. You can't have the system that Tanakh sets up where God gets it right most of the time. But the fact is, there is unfairness in this world. I'll bring up an anecdote, which I think of fondly every time this comes up. The snazzy English word for trying to justify God's ways is theodicy. So I have a sister, her name is Rhonda, and Rhonda and I used to play a game called Boggle. Boggle is a game where you shake up 16 letter cubes in this little bin thing, and then you try to make words out of adjacent letters. And obviously, the longer the word, the more points you get. So at least when we were I don't think I could beat her anymore, but when we were teenagers, I always beat her. And that's except for the small point games. Like sometimes it was 2-1, she won, that was fine. But in the high stakes games, when there were many words, I always won. So finally, one day we played a game, and she had a few more points than I had in a high stakes game. Like, congratulations. She had like 5 points more than I had. Okay, so far so good. But I had a word that I was pretty sure was a word, which was theodicy, which is 8 letters long, and that's worth 11 points for you Boggle fans out there. So that would have been enough to put me over the edge. So I had just learned it, and I was fairly sure I was spelling it correctly. I couldn't believe that it was in this grid, but it was there. So she thought I was making up the word just to get an 11-point play. I said, look, let's let Mr. Webster decide this one. This is an easy one. So we looked it up, and sure enough, thank God, theodicy was there, and I won the game because of it. And so I've always been grateful to this word ever since, and it's really very good. Tanakh has to deal with theodicy on a more serious thing, and they don't get 11 points for doing it. The problem of unfairness is the one problem, and pretty much every biblical book in some way or another deals with it. The classic wisdom way of dealing with unfairness is wait, be patient. If you see a wicked person thriving, okay, granted that actually happens, but he'll die. But by the time he dies, he'll lose everything and suffer. Don't worry. You just need to be patient. Today, there may be something unfair. That's true. But by the time everybody dies, it will all be evened out. Same thing with the righteous person suffering. If you see a righteous person suffering, don't worry. His fortunes or her fortunes will be restored before he or she dies. Okay, so that's the standard wisdom literature way of dealing with it. That's the way Proverbs deals with it. It's the way many different Psalms. We say these things in the Psalms all the time. Okay, so 2 biblical books can't stand that answer because for those of us who are keeping score, that's just not always true. One biblical book that deals with specifically the righteous person suffering angle is the book of Job. The whole point of the book of Job is no, you can have a righteous person suffer a lot and not have his fortunes restored. And that's just the way that it is. Kohelet deals with both sides. Kohelet is in the middle of a passage where he's complaining about both ways. And these 2 books are relentless about their protest. They say it's simply untrue to say that if you wait until you die, everything will all be evened out 100% of the time. That's simply untrue. It's untrue to human experience. And again, if there's simply one exception, it's over. All bets are off. Suddenly we have a problem. Okay. Now, by the way, there's one character in the Bible who never gets enough credit for this, but he actually expresses why it's not an answer to this problem. There is no human answer to this problem. But he expresses, I assume it's a he expresses why it has to be a problem. And this character is somebody named the Satan. The Satan is part of the angelic host. We don't have any Satan, like devil-like creature or being in Tanakh. There's no anti-God figure. The Satan is simply the prosecution angel in the heavenly court. So in the book of Job, he actually says the wisest thing ever said on the subject as far as the whole Bible is concerned. And he should get some credit for that. So I'm trying to restore his honor for this. You know, the fact that in English, Satan became capital S, that it becomes this evil, wicked thing, that's irrelevant. That's simply not the way biblical thought works at all. So the Satan tells God, Job isn't righteous. He's prudent. Think about it. He is simply doing what you want because look at him. He is wealthy. He is blessed with a large family. He lives in peace. Everything is good. Of course, he keeps your word. That isn't being righteous. That's simply being prudent. That is one of the best things ever said on the subject, because what the Satan is saying in that passage, even though he's not speaking as a philosopher, he's speaking as, well, the prosecuting angel in the heavenly court. Actually, the world has to be unfair. Because if the world actually were fair all the time, none of us would ever do anything bad. If there were immediate retribution for wicked behavior, if God really did hit us all with lightning bolts every single time we sinned, only the truly insane ever would sin, but we would have no free will. And the opposite is true also. If in fact righteous people always would live more successful lives, then inevitably we would choose to live righteously, not because we're righteous, but because that's just prudent. Nathan, you were raising your hand?
No, I was just saying that that's a very good answer. I agree 100%.
Thank you so much. So very good. So the Satan, so again, the Satan is, it's not a philosophical answer. Philosophers would not be pleased with this kind of thing as an answer. But this is the biblical, it's more of a response, but it's a great response. I'm with you, Nathan. The Satan really nailed it, that one. He says exactly what needs to be said, which is we have a paradox in the human condition. Either God is fair all the time and we're not really righteous or wicked, or the world has to be unfair some of the times, and that's the price for free will. It's not an answer, but it's certainly the way that Tanakh works. Okay, but that means, fine, so that's the way the world works, and that's the way Tanakh works, but that still means at the end of the day, the world is unfair sometimes, right? We haven't solved anything. It simply is a way of relating to the problem. Okay, so Kohelet gets all upset about this. So back to source number 16. All these things I observed, and I noted, all went well under the sun, while men still had authority over men to treat them unjustly. And then I saw scoundrels coming from the holy site and being brought to burial, while such had acted righteously were forgotten in the city. So he's upset about that. He said, here you have wicked people, they're dead and they've been buried with honor. Guess what? It's too late now. If the whole premise of wisdom is wait until they die and you'll see grace and all of that stuff, okay, but here I see with my own eyes, wicked people who notoriously wicked have good burial, whereas righteous people are completely forgotten. Here is another frustration: the fact that the sentence imposed for evil deeds is not executed swiftly, which is why men are emboldened to do evil. The fact that a sinner may do evil 100 times and his punishment still be delayed. For although I am aware that it will be well with those who revere God, since they revere him, and it will not be well with the scoundrel, that he will not live long because he does not revere God. Notice how JPS, even the Jewish Publication Society, see how they put in those quotation marks? They're assuming that Kohelet is quoting somebody else. The truth is, he's simply quoting his own received wisdom. Right? It's not him versus this quotation mark guy. He's simply saying, I believe in what I was taught. I know that God is fair, but in reality, my eyes tell me the world isn't always fair. And therefore, he goes right back in 14. Here is a frustration that occurs in the world. Sometimes an upright man is requited according to the conduct of the scoundrel. Sometimes the scoundrel is requited according to the conduct of the upright. I say all that is frustration. I therefore praise enjoyment, for the only good a man can have under the sun is to eat and drink and enjoy himself. That much can accompany him in exchange for his wealth through the days of life that God has granted him under the sun. So here's the wrong way to read this passage and the whole of Kohelet. You might say, since the world is unfair, just go party. Okay, that's not what Kohelet is saying at all. That's the way that one could mistake the book. What Kohelet does say here, and what he's saying throughout the book is, yes, even when we have a successful life, we can never pat ourselves on the back and say it's because I deserve it. It all goes back to the entitlement thing. We can't say it's because we're righteous and God is rewarding us. We can't say it's because we worked hard and therefore our diligence rewarded us. Every single thing that we get in life is a gift from God, and so we should enjoy that while we can, because there are no necessary results. But that doesn't solve the problem of unfairness, which is why he concludes, for I have set my mind to learn wisdom and to observe the business that goes on in this world, even to the extent of going without sleep day and night. And I have observed all that God brings to pass. Indeed, man cannot guess the events that occurs under the sun. For man tries strenuously, but fails to guess them. And even if a sage should think to discover them, he would not be able to guess them. So here's Kohelet presenting himself as the wisest man of all time, saying, I have no clue why the world is unfair sometimes. That's a good words to live by. It's a way of saying this is simply beyond human wisdom. But that's okay in the sense that, yes, it will always be frustrating when we see unfairness in the world. That will never go away. But at least we can now benefit from the world whenever we can and simply say, thank you, God, for whatever we are granted. Yes, we don't deserve it, or we don't know if we deserve it or not. There are no necessary results, but we can say thank you every time there is a result. Okay. Kohelet goes on. I think I mentioned this verse in the outside. I knew it was coming down, but I didn't want to start scrolling around. Here's the verse that I was referring to with the tortoise and the hare earlier. I further observed under the sun that the race is not won by the swift, nor the battle by the valiant, nor is bread won by the wise, nor wealth by the intelligent, nor favor by the learned. For the time of mischance comes to all. So a better way to say this verse in sync with what the rest of Kohelet is talking about is, the race is not necessarily won by the swift, right? Nor the battle necessarily by the valiant. But I'll tell you something. It helps to be fast if you're running a race. It helps to be valiant if you're fighting a battle. Same thing with all the other ones. And Kohelet constantly comes back to that message. Okay, so Kohelet focuses on there are no necessary results with wisdom, but be wise, be diligent. That part never, ever goes away. Okay, we move on to source number 18 over here. Kohelet is frustrated just by the fact that wisdom cannot outlast us. And since everybody dies, even very wise people, that part he never shakes off because it's simply, again, part of the human experience. In source 18, he says, I found that wisdom is superior to folly as light is superior to darkness. He never gives up on that point. Wisdom is better. A wise man has his eyes in his head, whereas a fool walks in darkness. Okay, all good. But I also realized that the same fate awaits them both. That bothers him because that's simply true. Kohelet goes on and on about how there are no guarantees. He focuses on how wisdom cannot endure totally. When I was a kid, the old Rocky and Bullwinkle show was on. It was a cartoon. Bullwinkle is this foolish moose who represents America. Rocky is this flying squirrel who is a sidekick, and they're always up against Boris and Natasha, who are the Russian spies who are trying to destroy them under the guidance of fearless leader. I think I have all these facts correct, even though it's been some time. And I think when I watched them as a kid, they were reruns already. So, I mean, this show goes back. And in the meantime, that was the main event on the Rocky and Bullwinkle show. But then there were the sidekick things, including something called fractured fairy tales. Fractured fairy tales were, they took stories that we all knew since we were children and they put on some twist that was supposed to be funny. And sometimes it actually was funny, if I recall. Kohelet actually teaches a couple of fractured fairy tales. So that's what always makes me think of the Rocky and Bullwinkle show when I read Kohelet, because Kohelet amazingly has fractured fairy tales in the sense that when you hear his fairy tales, you can imagine what the original fairy tale was. Like, here are the fairy tales that we teach in wisdom circles, and I'm going to teach my version of it with that ironic twist, and it's fractured. It simply doesn't end up happily ever after the end. Right? I remember when my daughters were 4, they just became Benot Mitzvah this past year. When they were 4, they were very into, not surprisingly, all the Disney princesses. Okay, so I don't think I ever really gave a lot of, so I watched all these movies a lot, by the way, at that time. And so I don't think I gave a lot of thought to these movies before, but I had to preach to my 4-year-old daughters a lot at the ends of these movies. What happens is you have all the action and adventure, and then with the closing credits, they have some happy song and the prince and princess get married. And then I realized, oh yeah, all fairy tales are that, right? They got married and lived happily ever after the end. So I'm like, okay, that's not what marriage is. Marriage is a fabulous and unparalleled part of human life, but now the couple has to work on that marriage the whole lifetime. It's not that, oh, you can have that at the end and now we can assume that they will always be happy. Right? It's a terrible message that all these fairy tales send. And so I don't want to tell fractured fairy tales. I would rather just tell them this is a horrible ending to any real life story. Kohelet, by telling his fractured fairy tales, gets right down to business. So here we go. Here's one of his fractured fairy tales. There are 2, so we'll read both of them together. Better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer has the sense to heed warnings. So you can imagine, here's how the real fairy tale went. Once upon a time, there was a king, but this king was a fool. And he always made the worst decisions. But then there was the poor but honest farm boy type who was wise and who was honest and who did all the right things. And he rose while the foolish king fell apart. The end. That's how an ancient wisdom's fairy tale would have gone. Something along those lines. So Kohelet starts with that premise. It's better to be poor but wise than to be the king who's foolish. So verse 14, for the former can emerge from a dungeon to become king, while the latter, even if born to kingship, can become a pauper. So far, so good. This is still in sync with the real fairy tale of that day. However, I reflected about all the living who walk under the sun with that youthful successor who steps into his place. Unnumbered are the multitudes of all those who preceded them, and later generations will not acclaim him either. For that too is futile and pursuit of wind. Okay, so here's Kohelet's fractured fairy tale. Once upon a time, there was a foolish king and a poor but honest farm boy who was in the dungeon. And the poor but honest farm boy was in the dungeon, but he was so wise, won the favor of the jailkeeper, eventually got out and rose to become the king. Whereas the king was so foolish, he failed and had to abdicate the throne. That's how the real fairy tale went. And Kohelet says, okay, the next day. But in the meantime, then the poor but honest farm boy who now was king, he failed and nobody remembered him either. The end. What he's doing is adding that real life twist, which was certainly not what ancient wise sages would have told, in order to get the point across, which is that story is truer to what real life looks like. We always stop with the happily ever after, the end, but there's more to the story. And the rest of the story isn't always as rosy as we storytellers would like it to be. Here's another one like that, source 20. This thing, too, I observed under the sun about wisdom, and it affected me profoundly. There was a little city with few men in it, and to it came a great king who invested it and built mighty siege works around it. Okay, so you have the poor but honest town, and in came this hostile invader with a huge army. Present in the city was a poor wise man who might have saved it with his wisdom, but nobody thought of that poor man. Like here you had somebody who could do it according to the fairy tale, but in real life, here the guy had a great plan, but nobody listened to him. So I observed, wisdom is better than valor, but a poor man's wisdom is scorned and his words are not heeded. Talk about a fractured fairy tale then. You had it so easy. All you have to do is have the poor wise man in the city coming up with an ingenious solution and saving the town. That's what they would have told in ancient circles, maybe even in modern circles too. But Kohelet is not going to tolerate that. The reality is it doesn't always work that way. Doesn't mean it always works this way, the way Kohelet is describing it, but it certainly could. So Kohelet concludes that wisdom is an absolute value. We always should pursue it, but we have to recognize that everything is a gift from God. We don't get anything because we deserve it. And we have to recognize that there are limitations both for a wise person. None of us, even if we pursue wisdom all the time, can ever bat 1,000. Nobody can ever reach it 100%. There are many shortcomings and failings. And there are also shortcomings in wisdom. That wisdom itself has many shortcomings, that human wisdom cannot fathom all the truths of the universe because God created the universe and we simply are limited by how that all goes. So those are the two major themes of Kohelet, and that's what I wanted to cover today. One is the value of wealth, which is it's wonderful. It should be pursued in moderation with diligence, and everything that we get should be viewed as a gift from God while we can. With regard to wisdom, wisdom is an absolute value. We should pursue it as much as we can and avoid foolishness at all costs. But understand that A, we are limited. We'll never get everything we want. B, we don't always make the right decision. And C, even in principle, if we did, wisdom itself has many, many human limitations because that's the way God did it. So when Kohelet says at the very end of the book, the sum of the matter, when it's all said and done, revere God and observe his commandments, for this applies to all mankind, that God will call every creature to account for everything unknown, be it good or bad. He says, look, we have to do our job and let God handle his. Don't overstep your boundaries and don't assume that we can manipulate the universe to make everything work. It doesn't go that way. God is in charge and we are not. We have a job to do. God gave us a job to do. Let's do that job, but understand that even if we do, there are no guarantees and that everything that we do enjoy in life is a blessing from God. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover today in the context of Kohelet's wealth and wisdom. And this is where I turn it over to the floor for comments, questions.
Question. Is Olam Haba never brought in?
That's an
That
excellent
would
question.
solve the problem.
It would solve the problem. Very good. I appreciate your raising that. I was even toying with the idea for the third and final installment of this series to be on Olam Haba, afterlife, because of your question. But I'm going to go instead with what I talked about already, that we're going to just look at 4 contemporary books on Kohelet. But since you're raising the question, it's certainly an excellent and really important one. So here's a fun fact. Tanakh never uses afterlife to solve the problem of unfairness because, and there's a reason for that, and that is because God promises fairness in this world, in the Torah. All of God's blessings and curses, you can read them over and over and over again. You will see if you are righteous, then you will have rain in its proper time and good crops, peace in your land, all the good peace and harmony thing. And if you are sinful, then you will have drought and crop blights and famines and all these terrible things, with the ultimate being exile from your land. It's all this worldly, all. And so Tanakh understood that. So that's why you have Kohelet saying, I'm frustrated. And he doesn't ever say, oh man, afterlife. Okay, sure, life might be unfair in this world, but in the next world, it will all be cool. Another good place where you can see how strongly Tanakh doesn't use this argument is in the book of Job. You know that Job is very upset about his suffering and constantly protests heavily against God. Well, he has these friends, right? These so-called friends show up and try to justify God. They're big theodicy people. So they use every argument in the book, the entire biblical suitcase or whatever, portfolio of answers that can be brought. They bring them all. And here's one that they never bring up. They never think of, oh, maybe Job, you're right. Maybe you are suffering a lot and maybe you really did not sin, but I'll tell you something. When heaven comes along, you're going to really do well. The reason why they can't even invoke that argument is because it doesn't exist. That argument was simply unavailable in biblical times, right? So that's why Kohelet doesn't use it either, because it's simply an unavailable solution. It's only, I give a whole shiur on this at some future time. I happily will do so again. At the very, very, very end of the Bible, you see the transition, which opens up the door to your question. 2 very late biblical books do invoke afterlife in some form to solve the problem of unfairness. They are the book of Malachi, which is the last prophet, and the book of Daniel, which is one of the latest biblical books of them all. Those 2 books actually invoke Messianic era to solve the problem of unfairness, meaning they finally concede once and for all, this world really is unfair and that bothers us. But when Mashiach comes, that's when all will be righted. And that opens the door to the period of the rabbis where that becomes a standard answer. So what you're saying is of vital importance to the history of Jewish ideas, actually, where you really can see this opening up of, okay, here's where it started, and then it just becomes part of our discussion. But if you just look at it biblically, this was simply an unavailable answer, which is why Kohelet is left sleepless and frustrated. Okay, Irene.
Hi. It was a lovely shiur. What occurred to me is, it seems as if King Solomon changed his mind between writing Proverbs and writing Ecclesiastes. Am I right?
I would say you could read it that way, but I don't read it that way. I follow Michael V. Fox. Let's reiterate Michael V. Fox's position. He could have written them on the same day in principle, according to Michael V. Fox. And I like that approach more because each one writes with a different pair of glasses on.
Right.
The book of Proverbs is writing with the pair of glasses of, here is the wisdom of our tradition as we've received it. Okay. And that's it. He's not focusing on empirical reality that you and I can see with our own eyes. He's focusing on this is the way it should be. And therefore, you as a wise student should always view the world through these glasses. Kohelet says, I agree with that. And that they're of one cloth. Kohelet totally accepts down to the end all the teachings of wisdom. But then he couples with it, and this is what makes it such a challenging book, what we all see with our own eyes every day. Whether in our own experience or at least if you just pay attention to the news. It doesn't have to be our personal experience, but there's some of this going on at any moment in any era. Okay, so Kohelet says, I'm not going to blind myself of what's going on around me, nor am I going to reinterpret the reality based on wisdom. Rather, I'm going to face the clash. And that's what he calls Hevel. Hevel is the most important word in the book of Kohelet. It occurs 38 times. If you like statistics, this is a good one. 38 times out of 73 in the whole Bible.
Wow.
More than 50%, even though it's a very small book. This is the animating verse. So Michael V. Fox understands Hevel to mean absurd. It doesn't mean absurd in a logical, contradictory way. It simply means this absurdity between what you know to be true based on wisdom and what you see with your own eyes, and they clash. So I don't agree that Proverbs and Kohelet disagree with one another. They're simply using different pairs of glasses, and they're both true all the time. Here's our wisdom tradition, and that's always true. And then there's empirical reality, which is not just yours or my observation. It's Kohelet, and it's anybody's observation. He's not seeing anything that we don't see.
Gosh, that's very interesting. I have to read that book.
It's really good. It's called.
Is it like the absurd? Is it like the absurd with the French existentialists that I studied when I was young, like Sartre and all that?
He quotes. His guy is Camus.
Camus, yeah,
So there you
Camus.
go. That's
yeah, we
that's
did.
Fox's
Yeah,
guy.
Camus. Yeah, that's the plague. Yes, the
So
plague.
there you go. So that's
yeah.
his favorite. So you can read his book.
No, Camus is very good. Very good.
Hold on 1 second, and hold on. I'm going to stop share so I could actually see what I'm doing. And hold on. Let's make that smaller. Here we go.
Edward Cohen calling from Israel.
Hi, Edward Cohen. Hold on 1 second. I just want to tell you the title of this book that I'm referring to. It's called A Time to Tear Down and A Time to Build Up by Michael V. Fox. Hello, Edward Cohen from Israel. And back to you.
First of all, I'd like to say what a wonderful shiur that was, and definitely a chip off the old block. But
thank you also.
You said something about Job. I forget who you quoted. Job was not wise; he was prudent. Something like that. Use the word prudent.
Prudent, yeah. The Satan in the book of Job. I'll review the point. God is saying, "Wow, Job is so righteous. He is amazing. He just nails it all the time."
Yeah, but
okay.
I have a question on that.
Oh.
So how does that fit in with Blaise Pascal, who said, "I don't know if there is a God, but it's worth believing in him. Because if you don't believe in him and you're wrong, you lose. But if you do believe in him and you're right, you win.
Right.
And if there isn't a God, you didn't lose anything."
Right.
So how does that fit in with that prudence thing?
It's a different kind of prudence. It doesn't fit in with biblical thought at all. God's being is a no-brainer across the board. Tanakh can't imagine somebody who would do what Pascal said, let alone somebody who what you and I would call an atheist or even an agnostic. There's no such thing in Tanakh. You either believe in the one God or you believe in pagan deities, so you're on the right track, but you just have it wrong. The type of heretic that you'll find in the Bible isn't somebody who is an atheist. It's somebody who does not believe in God's providence. That's something that did exist in the biblical world based on the fact that there's unfairness. So one response to that is obviously God isn't paying attention, because if God were paying attention, how could this be? Right? So that was something that did exist in biblical thought. So Pascal's wager is a different kind of prudence. In other words, the Satan is focusing on the reality. There is God, and God is providentially involved in our lives. But the Satan is just saying, okay, so let's say God actually is fair all the time. It's not Pascal's wager. If God is fair all the time, that means that you and I would be rewarded instantaneously for every righteous act, and we'd be punished instantaneously for every wicked act. That would be very fair. But then nobody other than the truly insane would ever do anything wicked. Because you see with your own eyes, this will cause immediate retribution. So it's not a wager. It's simply, so the Satan's argument about Job is he's not righteous. Look at his life. He's doing great. So he is doing this because that's the way that it is. So the point of the book of Job is, okay, the cost of it not being that way is for God to be unfair at least some of the time. So that doesn't answer the problem. It simply is. So by the way, just to follow up on your point for this, I need to get a different screen on my screen, and I'll share it with everybody. Oh, that's the wrong thing. Hold on. So cheerful. Hold on one second. I will share it. I'm just getting it. Okay. I have that, and I have to come back to you, and that's not it. Hello. And then hit share screen. And we get logos. Here we go. And hello. Where'd it go? Oh. Okay. Can you see the screen now? Okay. One thing that the book of Job doesn't do, and I'm not sure why, is it never goes. I wish the camera would go back to the heavens at the moment where the Satan loses his $5 bet to God. Like they sound like they make a wager at the beginning and God wins. Here's the moment where God wins the bet. It's all the way tucked away in the book, in the middle of the book, in chapter 27. Job again took up his theme and said, by God, who has deprived me of justice, by Shaddai, who has embittered my life. He knows full well that God is treating him unfairly. As long as there is life in me and God's breath is in my nostrils, my lips will speak no wrong, nor my tongue utter deceit. Far be it from me to say you are right. Until I die, I will maintain my integrity. Meaning I'm going to be righteous anyway, even though I'm suffering. This is the moment where, at least in my assessment of the book of Job, God wins the bet. Because here Job is fully saying, I'm being treated unfairly, but I'm still going to be righteous. And that's where he proves that he genuinely is righteous. Okay, so that's, I think, very relevant to what you are talking about here. So that's where the wager between God and the Satan, which is a very different type of wager from Pascal's, that's the type of prudent behavior that Satan accused Job of having, but Job proves that that was wrong, that he genuinely served God in the adult way. And Kohelet, by the way, espouses the same view as the book of Job, which is, even though the world is unfair sometimes, be righteous. He simply takes for granted that this is true. I see here, Nathan, I'm sorry for not responding to you way earlier. I didn't have the chat in front of me because I was sharing screen. I thought that Fox had published, you're right about all of these things. A Time to Tear Down and A Time to Build Up was published originally in 1999. It was reprinted in 2010. We're talking about the same book. Okay? And
Thank you.
Okay. So very good. I apologize for just only seeing your chat now. Okay, on that incredibly happy note, I want to thank everybody for participating again. Thank the Institute for Jewish Ideas and Ideals for sponsoring this. We have one more session this coming Wednesday, again, Eastern Standard Time, 8:30 to 9:30, same time frame, where we'll be looking at 4 books that either just have come out or will come out very soon, but I got a review copy. That's why I have access to it already. And just talk about 4, it's actually very cool, how different approaches there are out there. And we're going to consider what each one contributes to the overall discussion and factor in how does that square with what Kohelet seems to be saying. So on that happy note, I wish everybody a meaningful and easy fast for Tisha B'Av, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care and thank you.
Thank
Could we have the sources in the chat box, maybe?
Oh, let's see if I can do that now. Actually, I might be able to. Hold on. Before we go, let me do this for you because I think that I can. And then I will sign out, document, hold on, file, my computer, and Kohelet Wealth Wisdom. Ta-da. And there you have it. Thank you so much and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.